Okay, we are live. Welcome, everyone. It is May 21st, 2026, and we still have a little bit of time before the SSPX goes into schism, which is something that we've been talking about on this channel pretty much since since the consecrations were announced in February. We've been keeping, and even before that, when the SSPX was speaking to Cardinal Fernandez, we've been keeping an eye on it. But the channel's growing. We're getting a lot of new viewers, which is a good problem to have. But the result of that is that I was informed by a viewer that the information on Benevacantism was very good, but they needed a little bit more of a primer to just understand what is the SSPX, who are the players, all that kind of thing. So today, I am just going to sort of take a step back, and I'm just going to give a very thorough introduction to what's going on with the state of the July 1st schism. Why is this significant? Who are the players? And in order to do that, partly because I do always try to be fair to people's positions, even when I don't agree with them. One of the things that I'm going to start doing. Oh, I have people watching. Excellent. So please, if I move too fast or I explain something that or if you still have questions after I've explained something, please just drop that in the chat so that I can clarify. Basically, what I'm going to do for this live stream is I am going to be going through a couple of videos that are put out by some SSPX supporters, as well as people who identify as sedevacantists. I'm going to talk about what all that means, and I'm going to give people an idea of kind of the state of play, how we got here, where we might end up. So again, I'm just going to be going through, and essentially I will be offering my own opinion, but a lot of what I'm going to be doing today is really just providing essentially footnotes, because this is a conversation that is happening very much inside of a community. And so if you're looking at it from the outside, or you're just hearing about some of this for the very first time, it's a lot. So without further ado, I'm just going to get into it. I am going to begin with a video that was put up by the Catholic Esquire, friend of the channel. And also, but he's appearing in this video, he's actually appearing on an explicitly sedevacantist channel. And this explicitly sedevacantist channel, it's interesting because basically he's there in an effort to make peace between the sedevacantists and the SSPX, which is interesting and important because one of the things that we've been that I've been that I have been keeping an eye on is the possibility that essentially they might decide that the SSPX and the Sedevacantist might get together and form a council and elect an anti-pope. What does any of that mean? Well, I'm obviously going to have to define a whole bunch of terms. So without further ado, I'm going to hit the record button because I am going to be uploading this as a separate video. And we will just get into it. Okay, Katie from Nerd Church here. Today we are going to be talking about just the basics of what you need to know to understand the upcoming schism that's going to start on July 1st. So that I do not feel inferior, because I am going to be discussing the Sedevacantists. I am going to put on a very impressive fedora. Actually, no, this is my friend's hat. It's actually a Panama hat, but in a fedora style, so that I too can be appropriately chapeaued when discussing the SSPX. So we will just start, and whenever I will go into screen sharing, and whenever I need to stop and provide some context, I will. And if it's a lot, I will just go out of screen sharing. So that's what we're going to do. And here we are. All right.
I'm Kevin Davis. This is the Catholic Family Podcast, and we have on a first timer here. You might have seen the two of us together. We've been on podcasts before 2 or 3 times now.
And of course, it's being weird
with
about
Stephen
loading.
Cox, and that is the Catholic Esquire. This gentleman sitting beside me. I believe also a Colorado man. So we're doing a Denver themed podcast today.
Okay, so just to fill in, the gentleman wearing the trilby that he no doubt would tell you is a fedora is the Catholic Esquire. He attends an SSPX church. That is the Society of St. Pius X, which is a group that was founded in 1974 by a French archbishop named Marcel Lefebvre. They have been in and out of communion with the Catholic Church. They were initially excommunicated in 1988. We'll get into that in a minute. Then those excommunications were lifted. Then they were they were put into a state that's called partial communion with the Catholic Church. And that's kind of where they are right now. So it's like basically the SSPX, going to an SSPX chapel technically fulfills the Sunday obligation. So it counts as having gone to mass. They can do valid weddings. They can do valid Catholic baptisms. But other than that, they're not quite regular Catholic priests either. So the SSPX is kind of half in and half out. This is an issue because they are insisting that they need bishops, because in order to ordain, because only priests can only be ordained by a bishop. And that means that as things stand right now today, if you are a young man and you've gone all the way through seminary in the Diocese of Phoenix, at the end of the day, you will have to stand in front, you will have to sit down and have an interview with Bishop John Dolan, who has read your file, who's probably met you a few times, and he's going to decide, are you going to be ordained as a Catholic priest or not? And if Bishop Dolan decides that you don't want, that he's not going to ordain you as a priest, your options are to either say, I'm not going to be a priest, or you have to go and find another bishop who will ordain you. And the first thing that that bishop is going to do is call up Bishop Dolan, and he's going to ask him, well, why didn't you want to ordain that young man? And if Bishop Dolan's answer is, I think that he would be actively dangerous to himself and others if he were a Catholic priest, you might not be able to find a bishop who will ordain you. If the SSPX has their own bishops, they can ordain whoever they want with no oversight from anyone other than the Vatican. And so they want bishops. And the Vatican is saying, no, we're not going to give you bishops. So now they're saying, okay, well, on July 1st, we're going to ordain bishops. They are not even announcing who, they have announced where. It's going to be in Switzerland. And next week, we'll spend a little bit of time maybe going over the website for the SSPX. For the SSPX consecrations, because it's a lot. Like, you can buy tickets. They have souvenir wine bottles. It's apparently going to be a really good time. I sadly will be unable to attend. My only travel this summer is going to be going to the Mormon History Conference in Las Vegas, but I digress. The point is that that's who the SSPX are. They are a group of dissident priests who feel that their only option is to try to create essentially a parallel church within the Catholic Church. And the Vatican is saying, we're not going to let you do that. And they're saying, okay, well, we're going to go into schism, except they have this whole explanation about how they won't be in schism, which we'll get into. The gentleman on the left-hand side of the screen is Kevin Davis. I don't know a great deal about him. Frankly, I tend to not spend a whole lot of time getting lost in the fever swamp of sedevacantism, because you end up with a lot of groups that have very intense disagreements about what they feel are incredibly important issues. And then you find out that the total number of people involved in that movement, it's like 50 guys in a home church in Kansas, or it's like, you know, there's a sedevacantist group in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and it consists of like 25 people. So it's one of those things where people who are very interested in studying new religious movements, yes, oh, okay, yes, I'm sorry, I should have specified. SSPX means Society of St. Pius X. St. Pius X, of course, was a pope at the beginning of the 20th century. He made a lot of changes to canon law, as well as reforming the Latin Mass. He also made some changes to the sacraments. I've actually done a short video just on St. Pius X, if you'd like to check that out. But the point is like Pius X was kind of like, he was a reformist pope, but he was conservative enough, but he was theologically conservative enough and liturgically conservative enough that the conservatives didn't freak out when Pius changed things. So the result of that was that when Archbishop Lefebvre wanted to form his little priest club for priests that wanted to continue to offer the Mass in Latin rather than in the vernacular, he chose Pius X because essentially Lefebvre's argument was that Pius X had reformed things as much as they needed to be reformed, and that we could have just stopped with Pius X. So that's why it's the SSPX. It's the Society of St. Pius X. Okay, so anyway, this gentleman in the red shirt is Kevin Davis. He's a sedevacantist. Sedevacantism started in 1958, and basically it's a conspiracy theory. There's really, I'm sorry, I'm shifting around a lot. I'm in middle age, and that means that sometimes if I lay wrong or sit wrong, my back gets thrown out. So I'm trying to not mess up my back, but also be visible to the camera. But I digress. I do that a lot. Forgive me. So the sedevacantist position actually starts in 1958 with a conspiracy theory. And that happens because I'm going to go out of screen sharing for a second because this is rapidly turning into story time. Okay. So, and I shall remove my chapeau for the moment. Okay. So, we've all, been, we've all seen a conclave within, the last year. So because of that, we all know that since the beginning of the 19th century, they've had a special stove in the Vatican that they use to burn the ballot papers. And when the smoke is black, there's no pope. And when the smoke is white, there is a pope. And this was an innovation that was made in the 19th century by a papal master of ceremonies who thought that that would be a nice way of basically giving the crowd waiting for the new pope something to do. And this worked well for a very long time. And in the 19th and early and first half of the 20th century, they made the black smoke through the extremely high-tech method of having a handful of wet straw that was put on, according to some accounts, they actually used like a slightly damp cow pat to provide the requisite damp material. And they put that on top of the fire on the coals so that it would produce black smoke, and then they would burn the ballots. Well, in 1958, that system malfunctioned so that there was initially a puff of white smoke, and then the smoke went black. Now, this led to a conspiracy theory that said that a pope had been selected, and then that person who had been elected pope had chosen to decline the papacy, which is something that can theoretically happen, because when somebody gets a 2/3 majority, the first thing that happens is the master of ceremonies walks up to them and says, "Do you accept?" And the person says in Latin, "Accepto." And then the next question is, what name do you want to be called by? So theoretically, somebody could say no. And people have tried to say no. So the rumor then became that a pope had been selected, and that then he had declined, and then 2 days later they had elected John the 23rd. Now, keep in mind that this is not the account of events that was supported by any cardinal who was actually in that conclave, including Cardinal Siri, who is allegedly the person who was elected pope and then chose to resign the papacy. Siri was like, nope, did not happen. So, as they say in Hamilton, no one else was in the room when it happened, right? All we know is what people report, and what people were reporting is essentially that it was a fluke, it was a malfunction, and that's why now today they have a special smoke canister that they pop just to avoid any future confusion. But once people had decided that the Pope was not the Pope, that leads to all kinds of weirdness. So in the case of our presenter friend here, we have somebody who has actually never been in a regular Catholic church. He has, by his account, was his only experience with the Catholic Church has been as a sedevacantist, which, that makes sense, because this is a movement that starts in the early 60s. That means that, there are people who are, 2 and 3 generations into sedevacantism, where effectively that's their religion. But now that the SSPX looks like they might be ready to fully and completely go into schism with Rome, now some of the sedevacantists and some of the SSPX supporters are starting to get together. And they're starting to think, okay, maybe we can make peace. Maybe we can have an extraordinary conclave. Maybe we can finally get a pope that we approve of. And that's why this particular video is one that I'm wanting to really highlight and footnote, because a lot of people who keep an eye on the sedevacantist world as a hobby were of the opinion that they would not be able to make peace. And that's not what we see going on here. Now, I'm going to go back into screen sharing, and I just want to take a second to just have you listen to the way that these guys are talking to each other. And because it's not just what they're saying, it's their body language and their affect. And and they're doing the thing that people do when they're making small talk, which it's like, oh, where are you from? Oh, yeah, I know that place. Oh, did you go here? Did you know that person? They're making a connection as humans that are showing each other, okay, we might not agree on everything, but we agree on enough. We can be friends. We can talk to each other. And that is important because, again, these guys are operating in an environment where there aren't that many people involved in this movement, and everybody knows each other, or they know somebody who knows somebody. So if these two guys can make peace, if Kevin Davis and the Catholic Esquire can make peace, that opens up a back channel that could be used to get support for an extraordinary council to elect an anti-pope.
And also not a state of a contest. I know people are gonna be like, wait, who you had on Esquire? Is he even Catholic? So everyone calm down about this. Now I want to clarify, and I told Esquire before that I was gonna say this before. I don't agree with Esquire and everything. I believe the seat in Rome is vacant. He does not necessarily believe that. We'll let him explain his opinions here as we go along. I believe it's good to have these discussions with men who are of goodwill. I truly believe that about Esquire. I think he is trying to be a good Catholic and has some different opinions than I do. Now, do I hope that sometime he'll come to my conclusion? Absolutely, I do, of course. But again, in the meantime, I think we need to have these conversations. We shouldn't just be in an echo chamber. We shouldn't just be talking with ourselves and lambasting everyone who doesn't agree with every point of our faith. Now we need to stand up for what we believe, etc. Of course, which again, guys, I'm not changing any of my positions because I'm having on the Catholic Esquire. Let's make it.
Yeah, and I think that this, kind of shows you kind of how delicate a situation these guys think that they're in and how fine of a line they're having to carry. Oh. Oops, I'm in screen sharing. I should not have done that.
Okay. Clear, but I like him. I think he's a good guy. We're both Colorado guys, and I do think we're going to have a fruitful discussion here. I hope so. God willing, that will be the case. So Esquire, with that introduction, what do you have to say? Is there anything you want to start out with? I mean, I have a lot of questions that I want to ask you about the consecrations coming up, etc. But I'll give you the floor here at the beginning.
Sure. Yeah. No. Thanks for having me on, Kevin. Great to be here, actually. And so I'm happy to talk about the SSPX. I guess by way of background, I should say I do attend SSPX chapel. I've been doing so for a few years now. Before that, I attended FSSP for a while, Fraternity of St. Peter. And before that, I was...
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. Okay, so the fraternity of the FSSP, or the Fraternity of St. Peter, was an organization that was started in 1988 after Archbishop. Okay. After Archbishop Lefebvre's excommunication for having consecrated 4 bishops without permission from the Pope. That the technical term for that is having a papal mandate. So literally a document from the Pope saying, I, Leo, in this case, it would be Leo the 14th, you know, grant permission to Bishop Dolan to consecrate, Bishop to consecrate Father Peter as the new auxiliary bishop for the Diocese of Phoenix. That's a papal mandate. Archbishop Lefebvre did that with no mandate. The result of that was that he and everybody he had consecrated were excommunicated. One of the things that happened as a result of that decision was that a group of priests who had been members of the SSPX were like, okay, we joined the SSPX because we think that it's really important to celebrate the Latin Mass. We did not join the Society of St. Pius X because we wanted to be schismatic. So therefore, we are going to leave the SSPX, and then we're going to form the FSSP, which is the Fraternal Society of St. Peter. Peter, of course, being chosen because Peter's the first pope. And what they're doing is they're emphasizing the fact we are going to be loyal to the pope. And that, and that essentially it's a priestly society that is dedicated to two things, one of which is the Latin Mass, and the second of which is loyalty to the Pope. And the FSSP has been doing their thing, doing the traditional Latin Mass since 1988. And one of the things that's significant about them is that since they were founded by people who broke off from the SSPX, the FSSP priests tend to have they tend to really despise the SSPX priests. And the SSXP priests tend to think, well, these guys, they're saying the Latin Mass, but they're not sufficiently hardcore. So therefore, we are going to be opposed to them and all of their works. It's one of those things that people like to talk about, the narcissism of small differences. So you basically have two groups that are equally socially conservative, equally liturgically conservative, and equally theologically conservative. What they disagree on is, are we going to accept the authority of the Pope? So we have a group that is, at the end of the day, the FSSP is willing to sit down and shut up when the Pope tells them to sit down and shut up. They're still willing to take their marching orders from the Pope. The SSPX is not. That's the difference, and that is a not insignificant difference in terms of how in terms of how people behave and in terms of what they're willing to say, as we'll hear when the Catholic Esquire keeps talking. Oh, I better put my hat back on.
Novus Ordo. Oh, Mr. Novus Ordo, hardcore. I mean, I was.
Okay, just real quick, Novus Ordo is the technical term for the vernacular mass that was adopted in the beginning of Vatican II. It was put in place in 1969. And essentially what it did was it removed what the people who wanted the reform of the liturgy argued were basically Renaissance and medieval and Baroque accretions that had become part of the Mass, and that things had become kind of bloated and overly theatrical. And we really just needed to get back down to basics. A lot of people would, for example, point to Justin Martyr's description of the earliest Christian church services, that basically it was people got together, they read scripture, they sang hymns, they did communion, and that was it. So that was kind of the basis of saying that as long as you are singing hymns, reading scripture, and have valid communion, that is the heart of the Catholic Mass. And that if you have those elements, if you have those essential elements, that some of the other stuff is negotiable. It still needs to be recognizably Catholic, but there's some wiggle room. These guys don't want there to be any wiggle room about anything. I don't know. So we'll just see what they're going on. But anyway, when you hear though Novus Ordo, that is in and of itself a trad coded phrase. Like when somebody is talking about, when somebody who goes to a typical Catholic parish, they just talk about Mass, right? I'm going to Mass. If they have to specify the language of the Mass, like, oh, I'm going to the Vietnamese Mass, or I'm going to Spanish Mass, or I'm going to English Mass, they'll specify that. If they're going to a traditional Latin Mass, they might specify that, because the Latin Mass is, in current Catholic practice, the deviation. Sedevacantists and extremely traditional Catholics will always talk about the Novus Ordo to try to distinguish between the Mass as it's celebrated by like 99% of the world's Catholics and the traditional Latin Mass. So yeah, that's what's going on with that. So yeah, just Novus Ordo is very often a trad dog whistle, and that is something to be aware
of. Cradle Catholic, but fell away from the church.
Okay, Cradle Catholic, real quick. A Cradle Catholic is someone who was baptized as an infant. If you became a Catholic at any point other than in your infancy, you are regarded as a convert. And unfortunately, there are a certain number of people within the Catholic Church who view converts with hostility, partly because a lot of converts in the 90s and early 2000s were people who were being radicalized on the internet and were coming into the Catholic Church for not great reasons. That's a whole other discussion that I don't want to get into. But basically, the Catholic Esquire, by saying that, is sort of establishing his Catholic street cred, right? He's saying, I'm not somebody who used to be a Baptist and then went hardcore. I was always Catholic, and part of my becoming super religious was going to the SSPX.
for a while, but when I got back into it, I mean, I was, teaching the religious ed classes. I was in the marriage.
Okay. And again, what he's doing now is talking about, it's like, I know the Novus Ordo. I was in the Novus Ordo. This was my life, right? He's establishing his street cred. You can kind of make an analogy maybe to like when the Apostle Paul is like, oh yeah, I was the most Pharisee of all the Pharisees, or when Martin Luther said, if any monk could have been saved by his monkery, I would have been saved. It's that kind of a thing. So let's keep going.
Prep classes. I was like the mentor there.
Oh, yeah. I should have mentioned just real quick too. The religious ed classes that he's talking about, the Catholic Church believes in informed consent when it comes to adult conversions. And what that means is that if you are an adult and you want to convert, you go through anywhere from 9 months to 3 years of classes, like once a week, or sometimes, every other week. If it's generally, if it's a 3-year class, it'll be like every other week. And it's, like some months you don't meet. Or little kids who are getting ready for their first communion or for their confirmation will also go to class for at least a year, and sometimes more. Some programs are now going to 3 years or 2 years, depending on the age of the kids. And whether the diocese or the parish wants you to go, once a week, twice a week, it's a whole thing. But the point is that the result of this is that as you are, okay, yes, oh yeah, and Bede mentioned that that they just got done with theirs like 2 weeks ago, and then they'll be part of the team for next year's, which is pretty typical. Like a lot of times they'll try to get somebody who is, it is a newer convert to kind of help out, because they have that lived experience of knowing what it's like to convert, or knowing what it's like to be coming back into the church. So the point is, there's lots of religious education that's going on, and a lot of that you'll have the priests and the deacons supervising it, but a lot of that runs on volunteers. And generally the people who want to, run those classes tend to be people who are, very pious and very enthusiastic. And and the same way with the marriage prep classes. When a Catholic couple wants to get married, they have to go through a series of classes at their local parish to make sure that they understand what the expectations the Catholic Church has for a married couple in terms of how they'll handle their relationship. Now, some of that is, like making sure that they really, really know about the restrictions on artificial contraception. But it's not just about that. For example, there are discussions on like budgeting. If making sure that people have actually sat down and talked about, okay, who's going to be responsible for doing the chores? how are we going to handle finances in the family? Basically making sure that that couple that's going into the marriage is actually prepared to have an adult relationship. And that's a serious responsibility. And I'm not surprised that someone who was becoming stricter and stricter about his observance would eventually get to the point where he didn't feel comfortable, because there are some things that, the Catholic Church is willing to, for example, Catholic women are allowed to, there is no rule that says that Catholic women cannot work outside the home. And if you're getting radicalized online, well, that's, being required to, mention in the marriage prep class that, women are not required to give up their career when they get married, might make you a little bit uncomfortable. I'm just speculating. I don't know that if that was why he left, but I can see where he might have become a little bit uncomfortable with how woke and liberal the Catholic Church can be. So let's continue.
For that, and I was real involved. I was doing all the active participation. Never was a Eucharistic minister. I never wanted to do that. No.
Okay. Being a Eucharistic minister means that during the Mass, everybody who is in the church and is able to receive communion is going to need to get in line, step forward, and have somebody hand them a host. Generally, I'm going to stop sharing because this is going to require a little bit of, okay. And that could be, depending on the size of the congregation, that could be anywhere from, so to have everybody stand up, line up, walk over, say the body of Christ, the person says amen, you get it put on your tongue or in your hand, put it in your mouth, move aside, walk back to your seat. That takes a good amount of time, because we're talking about, a lot of parishes, even on a weekday Mass, there might still be 100 people. And there are some very large cathedrals that can hold, say, 1,000 people. Well, figuring that, just simple crowd control means that if one guy has to give communion to everybody, it's going to take a really, really, really long time. So the solution to that is to have what's called a Eucharistic minister, which means that somebody gets handled a ciborium, which is a special little dish that has consecrated host in it. If communion is being offered in both kinds, they might also be handed a chalice and a little cloth to wipe it with. And then that lay person, who has been very carefully trained, who has also, by the way, gone through a background check, because just by the fact that they're participating in the Eucharist, that's showing that trust is being placed in them, and they want to make sure that that person does not use that position of trust inappropriately. So that person would then offer the chalice and say, the blood of Christ. The person says, Amen. Takes a very small sip of the precious blood. They swallow, it's done. And that's basically done for the purposes of crowd control and trying to get, allowing everybody to have that moment of reverence and that experience of communion without just having like people feeling like, I don't know if I should receive communion because it's going to take forever and blah, blah, blah. And if it's really important to you to have the priest be the guy putting it on your tongue, you can just sit in the pew that goes up to the priest. But having a Eucharistic minister speeds things up. I have served as a Eucharistic minister, and I agree with, and like I kind of agree with the Catholic Esquire. Not that it's weird, but because it is terrifying. Like the best comparison I have to like the first time that the deacon hands you the ciborium and you have to walk down 3 steps from the altar carrying the ciborium. You have to walk to your place. You have to start distributing the host. And you know that the potential for sacrilege is low, but it is not zero. Because you could find yourself face to face with some edgelord teenager who has decided that they are going to hold a black mass and they are going to try to kidnap Jesus. From like a religious Catholic point of view, if they got out of there with a consecrated host that they had not consumed, that is kidnapping Jesus. And I, as the Eucharistic minister, have to stop that from happening. If somebody tries that, it's terrifying. The best analogy I can have is if anybody has ever handed you a kitten, like a newborn kitten, like eyes still closed kitten, or or a human infant, or like a very tiny chihuahua. And you know that if you don't handle this properly, if you mistreat it in any way, like this would be bad. This would be very, very bad. It's that sense, and I'm belaboring the point a little bit, but I need people to understand just this feeling of sheer terror that can come upon you. And everybody who serves as an EM feels that weight of responsibility. And it's kind of annoying to see somebody who's dismissing that, who is pretending like it's something that people are doing casually or without reverence. But again, it's important to realize that for people in the SSPX, for sedevacantists, they're seeing what in most Catholic churches is a perfectly normal and unexceptional thing that happens like every single day. They're seeing as being hugely problematic. Okay, so let's keep going.
I thought that was always weird, but so I have a good background as far as sort of my experience and you know, different flavors of Catholicism, I suppose. And yeah, so I'm happy to talk. And I think I found a real true home in the SSPX, and I'm happy to talk about it today with you.
No, again, I appreciate it, and I think you must go to Watkins, right? The big church out in Watkins, St. Isidore's. I also attended mass there for about a year. Boy, that's now 23 years ago or so. So it was fairly newly constructed. I think it must have been constructed in 2004 or 5, something like that. A big, beautiful church. It's amazing, right off of I-70. You can't miss it when.
Okay. I actually I looked up the church. And this is St. Isidore's Priory. Yeah, and notice they're saying traditional Roman Catholic Church, and so they're saying traditional Roman Catholic Church, right? They're very much not talking about, they're presenting themselves as we are super faithful Catholics. No, I am not taking your cookies. Okay, so this is the church. Now I want you to notice, though, you keep going. Our Lady Help of Christians, they have a Catholic school. They've got a calendar. And then you keep scrolling down and you've got, oh, look, you've got the letter to Cardinal Fernandez, the futility of the schism accusation, the episcopal consecrations, and this kind of stuff. But then you also have a lot of, Leo the 14th announces his arrival in France. The report, something that's critical of study group 9, but they're doing their best to look like they're in communion with the Catholic Church, even if they're a little bit critical, which, again, that is their opinion. Now, I wanted to show also, I pulled this up on Google Maps because I think that geography is always important, right? Okay. So this is a map of Colorado. And so we have St. Isidore Catholic Church and Priory, which is, you can see it's very close to the Colorado airport. So we have the Colorado Air and Spaceport here. We've got Denver International Airport. So this is off of I-70, kind of on the outskirts of Denver, which is important because this, where I just marked right here, is the Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception. The Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception has a mass in Latin every Sunday. It's the standard Novus Ordo rite, but it's in Latin. And if you live in anything that is on the, so here's Boulder, right? Here is Denver proper. We've got all of these suburbs of Denver. right? You would have to make a choice between driving to the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception to hear Mass in Latin or going to St. Isidore's. And that's interesting because that shows, because that shows that this whole, oh, well, we have a necessity, right? We don't have access to the Latin Mass is, if we're talking about this part of Colorado, just literally does not hold up to just like, let's go on Google Maps. Okay, now we are at the stop of that. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because the Catholic Esquire gives us some nice insights to what is going on, like kind of what are people talking about at a standard SSPX chapel, right? So this is, he's going to Mass in Colorado. What are people actually saying?
The chapel, the priories, etc. They are doing, some of them are doing their own educational talks and stuff like that that are set up, at special times for people who want more information. They've done a few of those. They also have another podcast series specifically about the consecrations. And that's pretty good. So they are putting out information, but as far as the actual Sunday experience goes, it honestly hasn't changed that much at all. And actually, I was just commenting to somebody the other day, is like, are people stopped going? Do you see a drop off? And the answer is no, not 1 ounce. And so, yeah, I mean, I really don't see a big change at all at this point.
And so do you think, so again, we're getting into just opinion, questions here. Do you?
Okay, so what he's saying, seems to be pretty accurate. I will say that there is an SSPX chapel in my area. I'm going to go there. I'm not going to be disruptive. I'm not going to take communion because I'm not sure if it's a Catholic church or not. But I'm going to go there. I'm going to, participate politely and see what they're talking about because I'm kind of curious. I can believe that there are, people that might be attending out of curiosity. I imagine that there are people in the SSPX chapels who are willing to go along with the position that it's okay to go to the SSPX because they're in this kind of half in, half out state that might be jumping ship. I don't know. It's interesting and kind of worrisome to me that apparently people, at least at this one church in Colorado, are kind of going, no, we'll just stay there.
You think? I mean, what Tucho Fernandez just came out and said, like 2 days ago that there will. Okay, we're recording this on Thursday, so in mid-May, I'll say that the excommunications will still happen pretty much. Nothing's changed.
Yeah.
If they go through with this, they will be excommunicated. Now, do you know if that just implies, as in 1988, that it's just the consecrating bishops and the consecrated bishops, or is it the entire SSPX? I mean, do you know any of the facts about that?
Yeah. So what I can tell you is that under canon law, under the 1980.
Okay. I would just like to point out really quickly that, yes, I do occasionally refer to Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez by his nickname, which is Tuco or Tucho. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. I think it's Tuco. But I do it affectionately. I like him. I realize that he has the power to destroy my podcast, and I hope that he will not. Um, but when I say Tuco, friend of the pod, or I wave and say, "Hi, Tuco," before I say something that might be getting a little bit spicy, I'm doing it because I'm acknowledging his authority, not out of disrespect. They're doing it out of disrespect. And now we're going to see some, well, frankly, rules lawyering about the Code of Canon Law.
W3 code. The automatic excommunications apply only to the bishops who perform the consecrations illicitly and those who receive it illicitly. So it's only the bishops under the code.
That is absolutely correct. According to the 1983 Code of Canon Law, if someone consecrates a bishop without a papal mandate, or if someone is consecrated without a papal mandate, by participating in that ceremony, they are excommunicated. That is a fact. So that means that the SSPX is going to be required to invoke their full powers of, but have you considered, nah, as they look for ways to get around that little problem.
Code of Canon Law, 1983 code, that an automatic excommunication would apply to. Now, these people in Rome, I mean, they're so bad, they're honestly evil. They act arbitrarily, they act capriciously.
Okay. I want you to take a moment to realize that when the Catholic Esquire is talking about these people in Rome, he is referring to the Pope. He is referring to the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, Tuco, friend of the channel. The person whose job used to be called Grand Inquisitor, literally the people whose job it is to interpret doctrine. These are the people whose job it is to explain what Catholic doctrine is on behalf of the Pope and the Pope himself. He is calling those people and the rest of the Roman Curia evil. That is a position that is an extremely strange position for someone who describes themselves as a faithful Catholic to take. Not gonna lie, that is the kind of thing, that's the kind of thing I am honestly kind of shocked to hear coming out of the mouth of a current or former Catholic. And I am saying this as someone who walked away from the Catholic Church and who walked away with no intention of coming back, and who came back, and who over the years was friends with a lot of people who had also walked away from the Catholic Church. And I knew people who, I have had the privilege of talking with people who were going to die-ins in St. Patrick's Cathedral in the 1980s at the height of the AIDS crisis. Those people did not describe the entire Roman Curia as evil. the people that I knew, we may have made Pope Palpatine jokes about Benedict. We may have been very angry with John Paul II for some of the things that he had to say about liberation theology and women's ordination. We may have not been very happy with the Catholic Church's position on contraception. I do not recall a conversation in which someone said the Catholic Church was evil. So yeah, that, like, I know I'm kind of harping on that point, but I'm saying that because I need anybody who's watching this to understand what those words sound like to someone who is a practicing Catholic, and how far outside of the Catholic mainstream these people are. And I feel like the best way to do it is just to present their words to the world and see what shakes out.
Would I put it past them to say, oh, everybody who attends a SSPX parish is excommunicated? Would I put it past them to say that? No, I wouldn't. Do I think they're going to do that? Probably not. It's just so, I mean, it's so clear in the Code of Canon Law who the excommunications apply to. But
it's true that the specific that the Code of Canon Law specifically only calls out the people who participate in the consecration. However, as he notes, that does not necessarily mean that the Vatican could not apply that to people who simply attend Mass with the SSPX, or they could place restrictions on it. And that's something that's happened in the past. For example, there have been cases where you have, say, someone who is where, say, a priest or a priest will, say, get excommunicated for very good reasons, or he'll get suspended for very good reasons. And sometimes in those cases, the local bishop will say, okay, this priest is suspended, and anybody who attends a Mass that this priest holds is excommunicated. Simply because there are times when that's necessary to prevent someone from, basically setting up a Catholic themed cult. And so if it's the judgment of the Vatican that the SSPX is actively dangerous, they could very easily decide to say, okay, anybody who sets foot in an SSPX chapel is excommunicated. Or at the very least, they could tell the local bishops, okay, you decide how much of a problem this is in your area. That is an option, and I am not willing to assume that that option is completely off the table.
But I do think they have another plan in store for people like me.
Interesting. So I guess I'll ask you, what do you think that is? I mean, do you think? Because I talked to someone recently.
Thanks for asking.
I forgot. You're welcome. I forgot who it was, but someone's like, I think what they could do is they could excommunicate everyone in the SSPX and then take out the restrictions from Traditionis Custodes. So kind of pretty much.
Okay. just real quick, Traditionis Custodes is the title of the document literally means custodians of tradition, which shows you exactly how Pope Francis was thinking about things. It basically creates a it created a situation where people are only allowed to offer the Mass in Latin under specific circumstances. One of those specific circumstances is having permission from the local bishop. Once I'm done going through the Marian dogmas, I'm going to be going over kind of some of the hot button encyclicals. One of them will be Traditionis Custodes, but we're not quite there yet. But all you need to know is that right now, there is a fairly strict permission structure to be allowed to celebrate a Latin Mass. One of the things that could very easily happen is that there will be, some rule that basically says you're not really allowed to go to the SSPX for Mass, but pretty much any priest who feels like it can just celebrate the Mass in Latin. So that would let people who are basically into the Latin Mass because they like it, they think it's pretty, they would be able to just live their life. They would just be able to live their best Catholic lives. But if they want it because they have weird and schismatic attitudes, then they can just walk out of the Catholic Church. That's actually a fairly realistic possibility, and it's one that nobody who is super into the Latin Mass likes, because right now you have a situation where if you want to go to the Latin Mass every single day, it may be that geographically the SSPX is geographically the closest group. And there are people that are probably going to the SSPX just for vibes, not because they're schismatic, who, if they're given a choice between vibes and schism, are going to are going to go, you know what, I'm not going to be a schismatic.
Say, nah, actually, what, we're going to allow the Latin Mass again, but not to the SSPX. I'll let you answer, or you can answer what you were going to say before, but that's kind of what I've heard.
What I think they're going to do in order to punish people who attend, lay people that attend SSPX chapels, and they're going to say that it does not satisfy your Sunday obligation to go there.
Well,
that's what I think. And that's,
okay. Satisfy your Sunday obligation is kind of a technical phrase that matters in this case. So I'm going to take a second to unpack it. Okay. So I'm going to go out of screen sharing because we're going to be, and I'm going to take off the hat. So I'm just going to explain, what does fulfill your Sunday obligation mean? Okay. So basically, theoretically, every Catholic is, would you mind turning off the overhead light? I'm getting really backlit now that thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm not a professional. This is what I do for fun on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. Anyway, so the Sunday obligation is essentially the obligation of every Catholic to go to church for about an hour and, spend some time hanging out with other Catholics and with Jesus, having our, weird little book club and snack time. And then we have donuts or we have brunch. It's a thing. Or maybe we go out to see a movie. That's fun too. But the point is that it's understood to be an obligation to go to church every Sunday. And if you don't, unless you have like a really good excuse, like there's a blizzard or it's COVID and we can't gather together, or, I am in, I am in the hospital, or, my baby is sick and I have to stay home and take care of my baby, like a good reason, right? I just don't feel like going to church is not a good reason. It has to be a good reason. But you're obligated to go to church every Sunday, and then also on certain holidays, which are holy days of obligation, and those kind of vary by diocese. But the point is that means that if you're a Catholic and you, I don't know, decide that you want to go to a Baptist church for funsies, right? You have this deep and abiding love for Hillsong, and you want to go to a mega church. Well, that's fine. You can do that. Have fun, shine on, you crazy diamond, but you got to go to Mass. And you cannot substitute the megachurch for a valid Catholic Mass. There is no substitute, accept no invitations. You got to go to Mass. Yes, okay, yeah. And then B brought up the very good point that, yes, you can go to the Saturday Vigil Mass because everybody knows that according to the law, that according to the rules, the Sabbath, the day starts at sundown the night before, right? That's when this, like, Sabbath starts Friday night. So therefore, for liturgical purposes, Saturday night is the same as going on Sunday. So you can also go Saturday night. And indeed, in some places, the power move has been to go to Mass Saturday night, go out and have a whole bunch of fun, and then you don't have to worry about waking up early Sunday morning to go to Mass. For other people, the power move is, just stay out all night, go to Mass Sunday morning, and then go home and crash. I'm just saying. But hopefully, having not done anything on Saturday night that would actually put you in a state of mortal sin, because that would kind of suck. But the point is that as long as you get your butt to Mass for like 1 hour Saturday night or Sunday, there's generally a lot of Masses in your area. It's not that hard. So it's generally understood that, again, the Catholic Church is all about getting people to do the absolute bare minimum. Because really, if everybody just did the absolute bare minimum, the world would probably be a better place. So that's why the Sunday obligation part is kind of a big deal. And that means that if somebody is really determined to go to the SSPX, and going to the SSPX does not fulfill your Sunday obligation, that means that somebody is potentially going to have to spend 2 hours in church every Sunday, plus travel time, in order to continue to believe that they are a Catholic in good standing and still go to the SSPX. And well, Dr. Dan McClellan has introduced the internet to the wonderful phrase costly signaling. And I would argue that spending, at probably a solid 4 hours including travel time, going to church every Sunday, especially if one of those is a mass that you actually believe is probably not valid, that's really costly signaling. And that would create a level of cognitive dissonance that would probably cause a lot of people to either just say, okay, the SSPX, we are in schism, we are doing our own thing, we do not care what the Pope says at all, even a little bit, or they quit going to the SSPX. Either one is possible, and the Catholic Esquire is very right that this would cause potentially really significant problems for the SSPX if they want to continue to claim to not be schismatic and to not be sedevacantist. Okay, so now we are going to continue for a little bit longer.
That's
Oh, I got to put my hat
could be
back
very
on.
persuasive to people. So
Maybe I'll
they
keep
don't
it
need
this
to do illegal excommunications. I think if they, and I,
Okay, I just want to highlight that word, illegal excommunications. So his position in this is that if the Pope and the Grand Inquisitor, and I'm just going to call him that for a second, because we can all agree that head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith is less cool than Grand Inquisitor. So if the Pope and the Grand Inquisitor say that you're excommunicated, but the Catholic Esquire's interpretation of the 1983 Code of Canon Law disagrees with the Pope and the Grand Inquisitor, the Catholic Esquire is arguing that he is correct and they are wrong because of the awesome power apparently granted by a law degree from a secular American university and the power of his really cool white hat. Well, I too have a really cool hat. I don't have a law degree. But I'm still pretty confident that, I'm also not claiming to overrule the Pope.
I think this is what they might do, is that they will just say that it doesn't satisfy your Sunday obligation to attend an SSPX parish, which would mean that if you attend an SSPX parish on Sundays, you would be in a state of mortal sin, I believe, because you're not attending Mass, right?
Yeah, exactly. You would be in a state of mortal sin. And not just for not attending Mass, but for a very specific sin called indifferentism, which is what it is when you say that basically there's no difference between going to the SSPX and going to a Catholic church, which is, by the way, the same thing that a Catholic would be theoretically guilty of if they were to start going to their local megachurch or indeed their local Lutheran parish, because after all, it's really all just kind of the same now, isn't it? I'm saying that because the Catholic Esquire would be the first person to tell you that going to the closest church that has a cross on the top, it does not count. So he's doing very specific special pleading for the SSPX that he is completely unwilling to apply to Protestant groups who are, in the view of the Catholic Church, basically in the same position as the SSPX.
Or at
Yeah, I would assume.
in a place that they say doesn't satisfy your Sunday obligation. So,
So I mean, what do you think then? See, this is one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on, because this is a question for me. What do you think happens then? I mean, if they do that, I mean,
and to be clear, they haven't said that. I mean, this is just me speculating.
Sure.
Okay. I mean,
yeah.
they may very well leave us alone. They might just leave the lay people alone and leave it at that.
Honestly, the idea that they're just going to quote unquote leave the lay people alone, that, friends, that is some cope. Like, that is, as the kids say, he is huffing copium. Because I don't see any way that they can excommunicate the bishops and excommunicate the priests and say, but it's totally cool if, Catholic lay people want to keep going to mass at SSPX parishes. I think that if the SSPX consecrates their bishops, they are going to be in schism. And the lay faithful are going to be in the same position that Martin Luther's followers were in Germany, or that Catholics living in England were when those schisms happened. At a certain point, you need to either fish or cut bait. And I think that the SSPX has reached the point where people are going to have to decide: are you in or are you out?
But I think if they really wanted to be mean and pack a punch, that's probably what they would do.
Well, then let me ask you this: well, if it's the least that could happen, so because they're gonna excommunicate somebody, it sounds like, so they're gonna excommunicate the bishop, as you say. So I've also heard that the 83 canon law is different, which I don't believe is valid, by the way, but it's different than the 17 canon law. And do you know how that's different? I've heard like excommunicate.
Okay, just very quickly, when he's saying the 83 canon law, he's referring to the current code of canon law, which was put in place in 1983. Teen Code of Canon Law is the 1917 Code of Canon Law, which was put in place in 1917, which was one of the reforms done by Pope Pius X. Pope Pius X is is basically the last pope that everybody agrees was a valid pope. It's the original Sedevacantist position was that it stopped it with the death of Pius XII in 1958. However, that has evolved a little bit. So now there are some people that want to pick and choose with their popes even more, and say that maybe Pius X was the last valid pope. It gets very weird very fast.
Literally doesn't pack the same punch. I did not look into this. I don't know what that is. I don't know if you know that.
I did. Yeah, I looked into that. So under the 1917 Code of Canon Law, consecrating a bishop without papal permission does not result in an excommunication. It leads to suspension, but not an automatic excommunication. So it's actually, the consequences of doing that are less severe under the 1917 code than the 1983 code.
Okay.
And I think that comes from what happened with Pope Pius XII with the Chinese back in the 1950s, because I think it was Pope Pius XII that initially changed that because.
Okay, yes, what he is bringing up here is historically correct, and I want to provide a little bit of context. Okay, so in the 1950s, the government of China the communist government of China made the decision that they were only going to allow religions to be practiced within China if they were properly Chinese. So this meant that for religions that had close ties to particularly Christian or Muslim or but basically Buddhists and Taoists and Confucians were okay. Everybody else was kind of like, yeah, you better do what the Chinese government says. And part of that had to do with the Chinese government just basically trying to take control of the way that religion existed in China. And part of that was that they had an official patriotic Chinese Catholic Church that all of the bishops were going to be appointed solely by the Chinese government. Now, this was not acceptable to the Pope for a whole bunch of reasons. And one of those reasons was because he didn't want anyone other than, because part of the core of the Roman Catholic Church is and of just the Catholic Church in general, is that the Pope is the guy who has ultimate authority. The Pope is the guy who gets to say yes or no on issues of doctrine. And part of that means that there has to be a clean chain of command between Father Joe at Our Lady of, at Our Lady of Perpetual Help. I was trying to think of some completely random Marian title, but I decided I didn't want to be irreverent. So, but the point is that Father Joe at Our Lady of Perpetual Help, there is a clear line of communication and authority between him and Pope Leo. And if Father Joe starts to get out of hand, he will just keep getting kicked up the chain until he fixes his behavior or he gets kicked out of the church. And that is a chain of command that has been very carefully established over literal centuries at this point. And the Pope was not about to lose that with the Chinese government. So that was why the Pope was like, no, if the Chinese government consecrates bishops, those are not bishops. They don't count. And eventually this resulted in the Vatican-China agreement. And it also is one of the reasons why in the Code of Canon Law, there is no wiggle room. Because right now, in the current political situation, there can't be wiggle room. Because the second that happens, the Pope has no leverage and no ability to say that the Chinese communist-controlled religion in China is not the legitimate Catholic Church. At that point, it's, hey, it's just your opinion, man. He says it's legit. The government says it's not. Who knows who's right? There has to be clarity. And that's part of and that is part of what is at stake with the SSPX consecrations, is throwing a whole bunch of very delicate political negotiations and very carefully crafted agreements that were decades in the negotiating could get thrown out or severely messed up if the SSPX is allowed to get away with what they want to get away with. And that's part of what's at stake. So let's see what else these guys have to say. I've got like another 15 minutes. I'm probably going to have to come back to this next Thursday, but that's okay too.
Because he was pushing back against consecrations of communist Chinese bishops in the 1950s. And so that's where I think that the canon law changed, and then it carried over into when they recodified it in 1983, the 1983 code. I think that's the correct history there. Oh. But definitely from 1917 to 83, there's a difference. It's a less severe consequence.
Interesting. And so, I mean, but the penalty of excommunication is the same. You are outside the church. I mean, you are pretty much, you're damned, right? And unless you are brought back in, unless you are forgiven. I mean, isn't that?
It gets a little tricky because so under the 83 code, it's a late sententia excommunication was an automatic excommunication.
Okay. Before we get into the types of excommunication, I just want to briefly throw out the whole issue of excommunication. If you're a Catholic and you're excommunicated, that is a potential like that is one of the cases where no salvation outside of the Catholic Church is something that a lot of Catholics would be concerned could apply to them, because by being told, okay, you are excommunicated. If you're Catholic, that means that you are basically rolling the dice on whether or not your principled agreement with the Catholic Church is principled enough that when you die, St. Peter will look at your situation and go, yeah, you had a point. You're good. Because if it's generally understood that if you're Catholic and you get excommunicated, that happened because you knew what you were doing. You made that choice. You have to be willing to answer for that choice. And for a believing Catholic, saying, you know what, I'm willing to be excommunicated is like, that is a bold statement. And that is a bold move. And it's interesting to me that the first thing that they're doing is trying to minimize how bold of a statement they are making.
But for an automatic excommunication, the requirements of the code of canon law have to be met. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. There is no excommunication. And under the 83 code, which is very interesting for the provision on consecrating bishops, it very specifically provides that the excommunication does not apply if it's done out of a state of necessity. And that's
okay. So automatic excommunication, basically that means that it is an act that is considered to be like so heinous and so like outside of what a normal believing Catholic would be capable of doing, that the second that you do it, you're out. You're kicked out of the Catholic Church. And like it, and I should mention, like, simply because one thing that everybody knows about the Catholic Church is that the Catholic Church is famously not really cool with abortion. Somebody who gets an abortion and they do it with full knowledge, full consent, blah blah blah, they meet all of the requirements, they are automatically excommunicated. I'm bringing this up because these two gentlemen would be the first ones to say that anyone who, like, say, gets an abortion, who is divorced and remarries, who engages in sexual activity and they aren't married, and I'm not talking about intercourse, I'm talking about like heavy petting, they would say that that person is in a state of mortal sin and partially excommunicated. They would not be willing to split hairs and rules lawyer on behalf of, say, a woman who has gone into premature labor in the 12th week of her pregnancy, and there is no way that that baby will be born alive. So that's worth considering when we're talking about these guys. So let's just continue. I want to at least get through the next couple of minutes of video.
State of necessity is not an objective state of necessity, it's a subjective state of necessity. So it's whatever, if the person who...
Now, he's correct. According to the 1983 Code of Canon Law, the state of necessity can be subjective. Now, this is specifically because in the 1970s, Pope John Paul II was a bishop in Poland, behind the Iron Curtain. And there were times when consecrating bishops or ordaining priests was something that had to be done in secret. There wasn't necessarily the ability to get a hold of Rome. And there were times when there were people in the Vatican that were like, don't do it, it's too dangerous. And John Paul II, who was in Poland, he was the man on the ground. He was the one who knew the local situation. There were a couple cases where he ordained priests or participated in the consecration of a bishop without a mandate because he thought it was necessary. And ultimately, the Vatican agreed that he was right and signed off on the consecrations and signed off on the ordinations. So when John Paul II was Pope and the Code of Canon Law was being rewritten, he put in there that it should be up to the bishop, right? That if the bishop thought there was a case of necessity, that he could make that call and shouldn't be excommunicated for making a really tough call. Again, this is a situation that was born in, we have underground Catholic churches that may or may not be able to be in communication with Rome on a regular basis. These guys are talking about the situation of a church, rather of the SSPX, who the main places that they have their chapels are in the United States and are in France. These are not people who are being persecuted by the government. These are not people who lack the resources to be in communication with Rome. So yes, by the letter of the law, it might be a subjective test, but there's kind of a limit to how reasonable you can make the argument that, oh, well, I think that there's a case of necessity when, Cardinal Fernandez and Pope Leo are both saying, guys, that there is no state of necessity.
Who is doing the illicit consecration truly believes in good faith that there is a state of necessity to do what they're doing, then the excommunication does not apply. Now, what happens and where it gets even more trickier is that what happened in '88 was like JP2 then he issued a document that said.
Okay, again, I want to point out sometimes Catholics will use abbreviations like JP2 or just say John Paul or John Paul II, because it's very easy to kind of develop this like weird parasocial relationship with the Pope, where it feels like he's, like your uncle or like, the guy that your parents knew in high school or something that you always hear about. And you kind of have this, very familiar relationship. I hope that that's what's going on here. It's also possible that he's saying JP2 to be disrespectful.
Well, we're declaring that the automatic excommunication applied.
Mm-hmm.
And that tends to throw people off a little bit, because it looks like, hey, we investigated this thing and we're finding.
Okay, he's implying something that wasn't implied. He's saying that there should have needed to be an investigation into the circumstances. What Pope St. John Paul II said was that according to the Code of Canon Law, if there is a illicit consecration with no mandate and no state of necessity, that everybody involved is automatically excommunicated. And considering that Archbishop Lefebvre was offered a deal in 1988 for the consecration of bishops, and literally ripped up the deal the day that the Pope was supposed to sign it. The day that John Paul was supposed to sign it, Lefebvre was like, no, we're not going to do the deal. So John Paul was just like, hey, there was not a state of necessity. This was a choice. This was a choice that was being made. And essentially that was the whole debate. That was the whole discussion. And John Paul was just saying, we don't need to have a trial because we all saw you do it. And so now he's trying to rules lawyer a way around that problem.
That there is an excommunication here, as if there was some sort of process or trial that took place, but that's not what happened. That's not what happened in '88, and that's not what's going to happen this time.
Because there doesn't need to be a trial. It's just pointing out that, like, grass is green, water is wet, and consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate results in automatic excommunication. It's just announcing, yes, I predict that on July 1st, that the sun will appear in the eastern horizon, and and that's just how I expect the world will work. It doesn't require authority or prophecy or foresight. It's just saying, this is how the world works, kids.
So why do you think that is? Are they just kind of afraid to take that step? I mean, because pre-boast, I mean, Leo the 14th could just say, "Hey, I excommunicate you." I mean, he has that power, right? I don't think that's changed, has it? I mean, who knows? Honestly, I don't even know what's changed in the papacy since Vatican II. So I could be wrong.
I don't know. I'm not a canon lawyer.
Sure.
I'm a civil lawyer. I'm a canon lawyer. But I think if
he's a civil lawyer, and I really I'm sure that he's very good at getting his clients off on technicalities. But that's not the purpose of canon law. The purpose of canon law is to just kind of keep the church humming along the way that it's supposed to, and to clarify rights and responsibilities within the Catholic Church. And, so again, also, Pope Leo is aware of optics as much as the next person, and he knows that there are a lot of people for whom anytime that the big bad Pope puts someone on trial for heresy, the person who's on trial in a lot of people's brains is automatically, oh yeah, that's Galileo, right? He is being suppressed by the church. So it's a lot easier to say, yeah, you guys are out, rather than giving them the opportunity to try to act like victims, because they're already acting like victims anyway. Why give them a forum?
If you're going to excommunicate someone, there's a process, and you need to follow the law, the canon law. And it's always been the case that, you have rights as a Catholic. I mean, you have certain procedural rights and things like that should be followed. For automatic excommunications, again, it's not a matter of having a trial or anybody taking evidence or the ability to cross-examine witnesses about what your true intentions are. Why are you doing this? None of that stuff exists. It's just a matter of, did you do the act? Was there a reason why you did it? Does it excuse the act that otherwise would result in the penalty? And if you look at the way that Archbishop Lefebvre did it and the way they're doing it.
Yeah. And that's the point. It is that simple. Fundamentally, it is that simple. The penalty is very clear in canon law. Are they going to consecrate the bishops, or are they not?
And now, clearly.
Okay. So that is kind of where I'm going to stop for today. Hopefully by now you know what a sedevacantist is, you know what the SSPX is, and you know a little bit more about what might be going on after July 1st when the SSPX consecrations happen. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop recording. And I'm going to thank everyone who stuck around. Next week, the first hour, I will be continuing with this video, making sure that everybody, has a good grounding on what's going on with the consecrations. That'll be the first hour. And then the second hour, I will be joined by Jordan from Reasons to Doubt. And we will be talking about how the Shroud of Turin is a piece of 14th century art and how that is totally okay. And